right. Hello, everybody. Welcome to episode 20 of Business Therapy. My name is Sam, and I'm here with Jonathan. Before we get started, don't forget to like, subscribe, and leave a comment so you can stay up to date with all of our weekly topics and discussions. Today, we're going to be talking about multitasking. But before that, I would like to take a breath and celebrate our 20th episode. Hooray. Who would have thought make it to 20? I'm just kidding. We're in it for the long haul, folks. So we're just excited that, we're seeing from 10 to 20, and hopefully then we'll say 50 and then 100. But in any case, today wanted to spend time on multitasking. Multitasking is coming up a lot in business as digital, especially people work from home. They have 1, 2, 3 monitors now. People are trying to do multiple tasks at the same time, which is sort of one definition of multitasking. And then multitasking in the traditional productivity sense of I have a work queue of many different types of tasks or activities, or mixing projects and operating duties, and people struggle to balance juggling all those activities. So I think it's a timely topic, and I think it mixes a lot of the things that we try to talk about: productivity, consciousness, how to be mindful about it. So that's what we're going to talk about today. So I'll kick it over to you, Jonathan. Do you have any initial impressions about multitasking, at least in your work life?
I think multitasking for the individual as opposed to multitasking for a company, and how those two look, because you said that obviously today, with all these efficiency tools and all this ability for us to get more done or access more information or be able to do more things, it's causing everybody to take what I think used to be considered a boon if somebody could multitask. I think I still see job ads that say ability to multitask is a must, and it's making that almost impossible to meet. So I think I'd like to talk about both dimensions: the individual and the company, how it expresses itself there.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing you bring up about the multitasking in job posts. I'm sure anyone who's been job seeking recently sees it, because I've seen it too, which is ability to multitask as if it's expected. And in a way, it's kind of the company saying at a company level, we're going to expect you to have a bunch of things going on that may not seem directly related at first, and you're going to have to be able to field that, which in a way is kind of a condemnation on the company's organization in some ways, that the role itself is not going to be consolidated, or it's not going to be contained in one lane of activity. Again, I guess you could say this is the topic, right? Is it a trend that we think is productive, that companies are going to expect people to be more versatile, balance way more activity than maybe they did 10 or 20 years ago, and be able to juggle multiple things on their plate simultaneously? And I think it's part of it.
I think that's the key, the balance. I don't think we're going to end up with some straight answer that multitasking good, multitasking bad, either on the company level or the individual. It's more just a balance. And I think we've had a lot of episodes that have led up to this in terms of organizational maturity and the ability to execute. So throwing on a lot of tasks or having the illusion of activity, as we've said in the past, that could be looked at as multitasking, but at the end of the day, it's about results and execution. So if the results aren't there, the ability to engage in a lot of activity is not particularly impressive.
Yeah, that's certainly true. You can juggle, but if all the balls hit the floor, then I mean, it's not going to be a good outcome. It's almost, but I do think it is going to be an increasing demand. Like let's start at the company level. When you talk about companies are going to expect people to be multitasking, again, the definition I'm using there is not doing like being in a meeting and reading a book at the same time, not like simultaneous activity at the personal level, but to have multiple different types of activity. What's that?
Let's pause there on the definitional level. So there is a very important distinction between having a lot of tasks at the same time in your portfolio, let's say, and trying to do a lot of tasks at the same time. So if we're here on this podcast and simultaneously I'm looking at my email and working on that, that would be considered multitasking, but that's trying to do 2 tasks at the same time. And every study shows that people who try doing that do both very, very poorly. But more importantly, most of the time when I see multitasking like that is during meetings, especially on these video meetings or, all these remote meetings now. And it really begs the question of, should the person be on that meeting? Because if I always see like people taking that period of time where they have a meeting coming up and saying, oh, good, I know I can multitask, quote unquote, during that time and get X done. Well, then why are you on the meeting? Like that's really just contributing to waste and ensuring that whatever you could have done during that time isn't done well. I love Elon Musk's rule in his companies that if you're in a meeting and you find you're not adding value or have nothing to say, you should leave. And it's not because you're not valuable or something like that. It's more, you don't need to be there. It's a waste of your time. You could be doing something a lot more efficiently with that time. And I think Sam's rule, tell me if I'm wrong, would be you probably shouldn't have shown up to the meeting, to begin with. But we'll get into the personal side of multitasking, but I definitely believe I'm a strong proponent of not showing up to things where you're not adding value. And I think if people did that more, they'd find themselves multitasking a lot, in the classic definition, a lot less.
Yeah, on that point, I just don't even, it's good to stay on this point for a minute, as you say, because this definition, I don't think we're going to talk about it in this way for the rest of the session. I don't agree with this. I don't even think it's a misnomer, in my opinion, because you can't truly, here's my take on this. You can't actually be doing two things at one time.
You're switching your attention between the two. That's exactly what you're doing, but you can't actually be doing two things at the same time, 100%.
Exactly. So when you say, oh, I'm multitasking, I'm doing work done a meeting, you're not in the meeting, or you're not getting the work done, or at least,
or you're flitting in and out. You're flitting in and out of the two, which is very inefficient for your brain. Forget about creating waste for everybody else, but it's very inefficient for your brain because your brain has to load the RAM for whatever the activity is, then load the RAM for the other activity, then load, and it's just doing that over and over and over.
I guess this sort of tangent around the idea that one could multitask and be in a meeting, which is sort of the new age definition, like be in a meeting and then doing work on the side at the same time. That's the definition we're dismissing outright. That is not productive. It's been proven over and over that's not productive. And like Jonathan said, it's really actually just you avoiding the fact that you either didn't decline the meeting when you should have, or you didn't bow out of the meeting at the appropriate time. That is not endorsed by us, and it's not a positive form or definition of multitasking.
And especially in hierarchical companies, there's always like different stakeholders who only wanted to make one point. It's a 2-hour meeting. They just want to make one point or make sure that someone else didn't make their point, or like, so in other words, each person has their own objective to the meeting. So they don't, in their mind, they're not even multitasking. They're just being rude, actually. But
yeah. And also remember the do no harm principle. And this is where a lot of times in process study, you even showing up to appear to be respectful or whatever you would say, and you're actually doing work on the side. If somebody invites 100 people and 80 of them show up just to be polite and they're multitasking the whole time, like on a big Zoom call or like a town hall, then the author isn't getting real feedback. The meeting host or the meeting chair, like they're not getting any feedback that says, hey, I invited 100 people and only 20 people thought there was going to be value. That's a clear signal, like to Jonathan's point, that the meeting was probably, the host had something off in their thinking. But if everyone shows up and they're just doing different work, then it's a disingenuous conversation. And a lot of things actually go that way when you're just trying to be polite, or you're trying to be meeting your obligations and being doubly effective with super productivity. It all often has that opposite result, even intentionally or unintentionally.
But, and I think transitioning back to where I think you want to go in the conversation, truly mindful multitasking is strongly related to prioritization and having focused objectives. So, the first problem with these meetings if you're someone whose schedule is just all booked up for you, and you're just reacting to everything that happens in your world, then already it's very hard to say what your prioritization is because it's been set for you. And, you scale that across an organization, and half the time, nobody even knows why any kind of meetings were set up. They're just a lot of people randomly showing up and not paying attention. So I don't know.
And that's not what people, like, we go back to the job recs you were talking about. When the job rec says ability to multitask, they certainly aren't talking about ability to sit in a meeting and pretend to be listening or engaged while you do other work. That's not what any employer is looking for. And that's not like That's not a marketable job skill or job skill set. So yeah, we can kind of put that to bed a little bit. But I think back to what you were saying in the more fascinating part of this conversation about generally as a company multitasking, or this idea that you should be taking on you should always have a workload that's full of different kinds of tasks or varied duties. I do think that's a trend that's here to stay. And I think it's actually one that people are asking for. Like it's funny because simultaneously people talk about being overwhelmed. Like we have a strong association with, hey, I'm multitasking these few weeks while I juggle multiple projects or what have you, with a sense of being stressed. But I think you just started to allude to it. It's actually variation. It's actually a lot of pros and I think benefits that come with having a diverse workload, a diverse set of expectations of what you should be doing for a company, a varied set of skills, a cross-trained workforce. And I think that generally companies are responding to the fact, because what's the opposite? What's the opposite of multitasking? It's back to as a very extreme example, it's our assembly line example, where you're just screwing in nut number 5 on the chassis all day long. And nobody wants that anymore. But if you don't want to multitask, that's what you're suggesting. You're suggesting going the opposite way. The less you're multitasking, the more you're just monotasking. You're just a cog in the wheel. And I think nobody wants that anymore.
And it's almost impossible, today, because if you're, what do you call it, monotasking? If
I just made that up. Yeah, I don't know if you should coin that.
If you're monotasking, then that means that something else isn't happening for someone else. You're constrained. So if there's a whole project portfolio and you play a role in more than one thing, or anybody does, and that's almost always the case because subject matter expertise usually goes across projects and the like, and you're only doing one thing, then that means something is not happening for someone else and information isn't flowing as fast as it could, et cetera. So there has to be a dimension of healthy multitasking in today's world.
Yeah, and well, there's so many levels of this when you start to actually unpack it. And what do companies actually mean, or what are they looking for? But I think you nailed it on the head when you're talking about you're going to have to expect that if you want to be a good team player, you have to be doing a wide range of things. You have to be able to be more flexible. You have to be more adaptable. This is what people are looking for in the workforce today. And this is what jobs are calling for, especially as change is happening in quicker cycles. And I think the biggest one is we talk about the operating responsibilities and the project responsibilities. A lot of times now in companies, large and small, we're making constant process changes, or you're in a digital environment where you're meeting different market demands and it's going faster and faster. You have your day-to-day job, and you've got to have project work that you're multitasking, things that are changing the process, things you're doing research, things you're working on small, side things, I guess you could say, that are supplemental to your day-to-day. Because if you think you can separate those things, you're not going to be changing at the rate that the market's demanding now. So I think there's that base level of multitasking that everyone sometimes gets annoyed that there's still this cultural sense to me throughout different client sites that people get annoyed when you take them away from their day-to-day. But that's an expectation. That's the multitasking a lot of people are looking for. You're going to carve out a certain amount of your percent of your day-to-day operating time to do creative work, to do innovative work. And people want that and they don't want it. I mean, I think that's part of the whole multitasking thing.
Because the problem is that the assembly line offers a high degree of comfort and predictability. So if I have a high volume of things, and that might feel like multitasking because I have many of them and I need to switch between them, that's not really multitasking if it's the same exact activity. And there's absolutely no difference in skill, no difference in perspective, no different interaction with people in the organization. And I think in an agile organization, you're not always focused on the how. So when people say they're being taken away from the day-to-day, they're being taken away from the how they're working. What we're saying is today you're looking at the result, you're looking at meeting an objective. And that's very fluid because how you get to that objective can change depending on some new innovation, can change based on market factors. We're getting so much data so quickly that you have to be able to change your how, but your why or your objective, that's not going to change. So flexible people are focused on that and how they can add value to that. And that can change day to day. But if you're so caught up in your how, then you're definitely not going to be part of that more conscious interaction.
And I think that is what, if I'm dissecting what people are talking about when they say we want people to be able to multitask, I think you hit it on the head right there, which is people have to be adaptable in jobs now. And I think if your perception is, well, if I'm having to do a bunch of things that are outside of my expertise and my core tasks that I do day in and day out, and you consider that different types of tasks, you consider that multitasking, then yes, everyone is going to have to start multitasking, because that's the point you're making, which is with so much data coming in, that's why everything's getting faster. You have to change constantly. You have to be in this constant change curve. And that's where most people, I think, they struggle with themselves, because I do think people want to be there. But then, like you said, it's easy to get overwhelmed. Well, let me phrase it this way, because I feel when I listen to people, they don't want to be on the assembly line. Like the millennials and Gen Z, that's mind numbing, and everyone hates that. And it's like everyone's worst nightmare. But as soon as you throw way too many things at them too fast, or they feel like they're having to learn too many new things, then they're multitasking and they're overwhelmed. So what is the middle ground? And I think we have to have that's the topic of conversation of, well, is multitasking good or bad? We want variation in our day-to-day, and we want to have clear objectives, that we have the tools and we can be autonomous and we can be creative and we can solve them. And if that's overwhelming or stressful, that's something that you have to manage. But that's sort of the nature, I think, of where the beast is going.
I think the employer, to meet that dynamic that you said about, new employees or employees in general, in order for them to meet that challenge, they need to be focused on two things: being very transparent on what the objectives are, what people are trying to do, and how you as an individual are being measured, and how you as an individual are being assessed, because that's the only place that you could possibly take comfort. Because otherwise it's totally up for grabs how I'll be productive or not be productive, etc. Now, that measurement, I think, would be a little bit different than maybe what's in the traditional performance reviews, but I do think that there needs to be that some kind of structure to give somebody grounding on how they can go about their day successfully. I don't know if you agree with that.
I'm processing that, because I agree fundamentally that as human beings, and I think we're quickly getting to the edge of what it means to be human in the workplace a lot of the time, we do want some grounding. I agree with that. I think everyone wants and craves stability. It feels like security. I think we associate stability and the ability to say, hey, I know what's coming and I know what I'm doing and I know how to handle it. It gives a lot of people comfort, and they need a certain percentage of that. But as we keep talking about everything getting faster in business, personally, there's so much more data, there's so much more access, that necessitates us to constantly give up grounding and to be able to not build these heavy structures of consistency and standard and be more nimble. So I agree that people want it, but I also think that it's almost going to be a limiter to people's careers and their professional.
Let me make it what I was saying is that the measurement would not necessarily be how many hours you spent that day, or what you produced, in terms of paperwork or something like that. I don't know, whatever common measures might be, but it would be your relative contribution to helping a group or the company achieve a certain objective. And that and how you express that that's wide open. You could be innovative in what you do. And the company should be flexible in saying, oh, I thought you were going to contribute this way, but wow, you're contributing that way. And it's helping us reach the objective. That's, I think, much more conscious. And it still gives you some parameter, because otherwise, let's say you're working for, a sneaker manufacturer, and you're sitting there designing spaceships, in other words, you need some orientation for what you're doing.
I'm in alignment, and that's where we're getting into the meat of, I think, just debunking the word multitasking all around, because I think if I'm listening and I'm hearing what you're suggesting and I'm in agreement, the incentive structures, the measurement structures all need to be keyed into groups to the organism as a whole, right? We have an objective as a company or as a team or as a department, and how we go about meeting that. Everyone should be creative. They should be reading each other. They should be collaborating, cohesive. And that's just the work that is that job is just going to be whatever it is in that moment, as long as they're being measured on the objective and creating value and moving directionally where the company needs to be going. And if you look at your job title in a role of the future, let's say that we're talking about, it's really going to be just do what you need to get it done. And if you like that kind of role, then you could say that, like in reference to our multitasking conversation, you could say, well, my day changes day to day and I love it and I'm just doing my job. And in a way, no one would say that, oh, I'm forced to multitask all the time. It's where that definition has that implication that you were expecting, or one who would expect a certain level of standard behavior or grounding or security, you're going to have to forego that and have multiple tasks at a time that you may feel comfortable or unfamiliar with. And if you look at it that way, it's really a mindset ultimately. And the workforce of the future is not, I don't think, going to have this expectation that, well, I'm hired to do A and I'm not going to have to do anything but A. Like that's not going to, I think that this is kind of a language almost in this conversation to me that's going to end up being phased out, because everyone is going to have to be more dynamic. Everyone's job is going to have more color. It's going to have more range.
The resistance to it is in legacy entities that are producing things that require essentially an assembly line of some sort, because it's highly repetitive tasks, but they haven't achieved the automation that they should. And so their concept of what a role is, they would be like, it would be chaos otherwise. So you need people that are just doing these repetitive tasks all day. So we get out our, whatever it is we're producing, tax returns, but the problem is that they're already past the curve. They're already behind the curve because they already should have automated all of that. And then they wouldn't think of it the same way.
Well, that to me is the real insight. You just nailed it, which is that in this day and age, if something is repetitive enough to be secure, any company who's doing their job should have put that to robots or automated it, so that that's not the job that people are doing or would want to do or expected to do. And in that sense, it lends to this growing articulation of the future positions where you would never expect to have a position where you're just doing the same thing every day. Because if you are, you're just in a company that's behind, is another way to say what you just said, I think.
100%. I think you said it better. I think that the real challenge for me in all this, though, is that the examples of conscious companies, or the examples of companies where the multitasking, what we're saying would be good multitasking, is a good idea, is very low. And as we keep saying, 70% of project activity is wasteful, not resulting in anything. So the real tragedy, or the real problem I have, is that for most entities, I judge multitasking based on a result. So if you're doing 10 activities and you hit your target 10 times, then you can multitask, as a company. But if you're doing 50 activities and you've almost hit one target, then that's not multitasking. That's chaos, or that's just complete waste. The image that comes to me as I'm saying it, and I think it's from something you said earlier. I've seen, that the basketball game in like arcade game, sometimes in bars where you have to get like the basketball in as many times as possible, and they just keep rolling down, and you just keep putting it in. And if you ever see drunk people do that, they're throwing the ball. Everyone's having a great time. They have almost no scores. Almost nothing goes in. Everything hits each other. Things fall outside. And that's the kind of image I'm seeing with this multitasking at most entities. Because when I look at the score, it's not going up. They're for every 50 shots, they're hitting one. And I think that's not really a dimension of multitasking that we're talking about, but it makes all these tasks pretty wasteful and not mindful.
Yeah, and it also, as we dig in this conversation, I realize how it also has to imply, like you said, that they're not cohesive. In a way, the idea that they're multitasking implies that the balls are going to be crashing into each other because they're not harmonized. Like they're tasks that are coming at you from different places and they're chaotic. They have to be chaotic somewhat in their nature, because if they were all cohesive, again, it would be part of harmonized activity, and one wouldn't consider it multitasking, I think. And that's why I as we get into it more, my punchline would be kind of variation in tasks is good. Autonomy is good. Objective-based work is good. Multitasking juggling multiple unlike priorities, taking on chaotic requests from different places that are not articulated well, or they don't have any relation to one another. I think that's bad, and that's always going to be bad. I mean, like you said, you don't want to have 50 things on your plate, and sure, you can manage it, but you only get a few done. That's a matter of, you shouldn't have had all those things on your plate. Those things shouldn't have even been given to you. So I guess that may be a whole deeper layer or level of it.
Well, I think that's the same thing, like with the basketball analogy I gave. Like, it's activity and you get it done. You put the ball up, it went through didn't go in, but it dribbled back down, and you cycle through until the end of the game. But you haven't really moved anything forward. That's the dynamic that I find very, very problematic.
Yeah,
so
totally
that's
agree.
I mean, that it goes to all our old conversations about, organizational maturity and, how you get things done in an organization. And I think that activity needs to be mindful too.
Yeah, and I mean, in a way, this whole conversation is driven around: are we pro or con, or are we for or against the idea that multitasking should be in a healthy job requisition? Like, should somebody be expected to multitask? And I think really the summary is no, it shouldn't, because you should be not special. Like, you should be willing to do a wide range of activity to meet your objectives at work, but the work that you're expected to do should be cohesive, and it should be consciously curated. And that doesn't mean it has to be falling within a narrow range of activities. It could be extremely broad range of activities, but it should be cohesive. It should never feel that you're juggling a bunch of things that don't have any relation to each other. I can't think of a single work scenario, a conscious work scenario, and I think that's a lot of what you've been articulating, Jonathan, where that was the case, where one would be expected to manage large numbers of work that have no relation to one another, and constantly require you to switch gears and skill sets almost entirely with no overlap. I don't think that really helps harness people's ability to produce value, and it really doesn't help companies with productivity overall.
I think, looking at the individual, there's a book, Essentialism, and do you know this book, Sam? Essentialism. Trying to remember what.
Never heard of that one. Essentialism.
So it's basically there's several ideas in it. One of which you are definitely a major proponent of, which is just stop doing things that you're not engaged in. If you don't feel engaged, stop doing them. Put your energy where you feel engaged, and you'll be surprised how the universe, comes to you and, meets you halfway or all the way in that scenario. But the other is, and he has this famous diagram where he shows like a person and then arrows going out of this circle, and that's doing multiple things. And then there's one long arrow. And I guess the theory is that if you put all your energy into one thing and did it well, you'd get very far, as opposed to diffusing all your energy. So I think that there's an element of that, and something about what you just said made me think about this idea of diffusing energy versus, having, concentrating or focusing energy. And so I guess my takeaway as an individual is, if you're just randomly going through all these different tasks and you're not actually making an impact or adding value, then that's diffusing it. Your ability to multitask is directly correlated to your ability to add value. So if you can have multiple arrows that are going far out from you, great, but I think you have to first be able to learn how to make your engagement have impact. And as you learn that, what that feels like, you can, expand your dimensions that in which you could participate.
Yeah, you're saying you want to make sure that you're being productive in the things that you're managing, and you shouldn't be spending. I mean, it's another nod. It sounds like, to summarize what you're saying, you shouldn't be spending a lot of energy doing things that you have no competency or interest in, because that's really a way to diffuse a lot of energy.
Yeah, or in which you're making any impact. So like, just to checklist off all these tasks all day long, at the end of the day, you're not going to have much to show for it. So you want to make sure that it's very mindful in terms of achieving something.
Well, and it comes back to a lot of our principal tenets of personal energy management, which I think is important to reiterate here, where you get the best bang for your buck or the best ROI on your energy if you spend it doing things you want to do. If you get excited and you get into flow and you pick an array of tasks that in whatever context they're being done in makes you excited, because then your output's going to be higher and you're going to be doing more. I think for some people in life, they do want to do the same process over and over endlessly. They have an undying passion for it. And at the far end of the spectrum, I see artists who exhibit this a lot, like a painter who, they can make a million paintings and it looks like they're doing the same thing, but to them, everything has a similar aesthetic, but it's slightly different works of art, and each work of art is unique, and they'll just do that forever. People who make certain kinds of music, people who do sculptors, these are people who are honed in and they just want to do this and they love it and they'll do it to a crazy extent. And then there's people who there's no rhyme or reason from an external point of view. They could be 100 tasks and they pick 80 of them randomly, just whatever they feel like doing that day, and they get a level of general competency across them, and they become very versatile. If they enjoyed it the whole time, then that path can be just as productive, if not more productive for them than the other. There's no right, except like you have to listen to yourself and follow where your energy wants to go.
There is a big difference in the artist, though, because in the artist scenario, their relationship to a larger organism is just a market. But when you're part of a business, a conscious business, you have an impact into that business, and that impact has has an impact on you. And so if you just if you can't elevate your consciousness to be able to do more things, then you will be a constraint to the energy, and whether you realize it or not.
Well, that's why people who have a singular focus, they tend to, like artists, they tend to be working more solo. They don't tend to be complexed into larger organisms, because I agree, as you say, in sort of a futuristic work setting where it's a lot more about the organism, the company is kind of a network that everyone is interfacing. The more tasks that you perform and the more people you interface with, it gives you more data, it gives you more vision, it gives you more connectivity to wider parts of the company. And in that, you increase your utility. And that's not to say that you have to be the best networker. It just means that when you do the things you like doing, your interfaces with either the people who are giving you inputs or the people whose outputs are receiving your outputs, you have connectivity and you can listen to them and you can do more to help and integrate into the network. And I think in general, that concept alone is, I'll get more technical from a process perspective, it's where the market is favoring generalized employees and cross-trained employees versus specialized ones. I think there was a long time where people thought, well, I will become the best underwater pipe welder and I will be paid to just do that over and over and over. But businesses need people who we're talking about are more flexible. They're willing to complex within different parts of the organization. They're willing to be flexible and fit turnkey solutions. Everything is more on demand. And to do that, everyone at a certain skill level needs to be cross-trained to do what everyone else can do. That's just a principle that makes the organization more flexible and more able to take on blows from the market or rapid changes or what have you. So I think as a trend generally, I know I'm kind of going off a bit on this, but you sort of to bring this idea of, well, the more you can do, the more utility you can add to the organization. We're seeing that on the process side too, and I'm in 100% alignment. And I think that's the real multitasking, is really just the idea that I need to be able to contribute across all the skills that I could possibly command. I have to find out what's the most interesting to me, and I need to learn all I can, because I think being cross-trained is generally the expectation, and it makes you a more usable human resource.
Yeah, so you show up to work with your welding torch, and it turns out that they figured out a way to weld everything together without the welding torch. You got to be adaptable enough to just put it down and say, okay, roll up my sleeves. How else can I help here? One trend that I really like, though, that shows that there is an evolution going this direction is, I remember, I don't know how many years back, but people were very nervous about their first job, like, oh, what should be my career? And this was some big decision, almost like now you're going to be locked in. And one of the trends that I like is I see a lot more job hopping and a lot more, varied resumes at the beginning of someone's career. And I think that's wonderful, because how are you going to know what engages you if you don't try a few things? And I think that's what you should be doing early on. I think once upon a time that was looked at as not stable, so like someone's stability where they in the same industry in the same job for 50 years, that's the kind of person, we're looking for. And I think what Sam and I are saying now is that that's exactly the opposite of where consciousness is going, and really adaptable and agile companies, because your utility diminishes dramatically with your inability to adapt.
Agreed. And I don't know, I still feel like we're in transition. I remember, I think it was in the late 2000s and early 2010s where that was still the conversation, where everyone's advice was, well, you can't jump, you haven't been there for more than a year, and you're going to look flighty and you're going to look non-committal. And now I think it is changing with the generations kind of swapping in and out of leadership now. But I mean, that's still, I guess, depending on who you ask, people say, oh, you exhibit no loyalty. But like you said, I know people in my cohort, when we're hiring, if I see somebody who grew in a company and has 15 years in one company, that's a red flag, more so than
Especially if it was the same, doing the same exact thing.
Yeah, doing the same thing. Well, I mean, unless I have that one, square hole that you need to put squares into, then like what am I going to do?
Or you better damn well hope that nothing changes in the future about this job, about the role, that nothing, that there's no innovation or no ability to iterate from it, because otherwise there's not a lot of stability in that. And that's another thing. People really crave the people that need the routine of the how the most, because it gives them some sense of security or some sense of predictability, don't realize it, but they're doing activity that's the least stable of any activity that exists in the organization. So because it's like you said before, the easiest to automate. So,
well, stability, that's where, I feel like we're getting to a natural stopping point, where something to reflect on is that, and I've said this in various forums, the new stability is getting comfortable with the constantly changing environment and what that means to you. That there's a form of stability one can find in showing up to work and knowing every day things are going to change. And I have my processes to handle change, and I have the ways I'm going to learn new things, and I have the ways I'm going to contribute. But that means stability is going to come in your own resilience and your own personal process. It's not going to come externally. I think stability in this next generation is really going to have to be generated internally. And that's the evolution of people and the evolution of work. Because like you said, I think it's going to be very quickly apparent in the next decade that if you're the kind of person that wants the same job, the same duties, and the same external circumstances to be fixed around you, that's going to be expecting the impossible, not the other way around. I think it's very quickly going to be flipped, and just in the course of like 10 or 15 years, really. I mean, it's going to be 100% reversal, I think.
I still, I'm going to end on one thought from my side, even though it probably goes against most of where it sounds like I was heading for most of the conversation. I still say that organizations and individuals should do less and succeed in more, rather than just doing a lot, because it mimics this new consciousness that you're alluding to, Sam, where there's a lot more variation in people's tasks, etc. That's a simulation of being adaptable and being agile if there's not value being added. So I still think that people need to learn how to crawl before they walk, before they run. And otherwise you get this real gangly person running down the hall, like that isn't really very directional.
Yeah. Well, and also I'll add just a postscript to that, because I actually don't think it's as counterintuitive as you think. Like it was very evocative to me. I mean, when Jonathan's talking about doing less, it can almost in a way be being successful at less almost requires more. I mean, would you rather build a beautiful award-winning sculpture, or would you rather pump out 50 that are just squares, just cut out of wood? It's kind of, to do the one thing right, it's going to take a lot more dynamism. It's going to take a lot more variation. It's going to take a lot more flexibility and cohesion. And that's conscious business. And that's us being conscious people. So I think it's very aligned.
And that's a great note for us to end our 20th
episode. Thank you. Yep. And with that, we will see you next week for another exciting conversation.